So we are ready to begin. We'd like to welcome everybody to today's local government education program, the first in a five-part series on rural business transitions. Brought to you through the collaboration of Rural Partners, the Illinois Institute for Rural Affairs, and Illinois Extension. Today's program is entitled Navigating an Era of Transition in American Business, Emerging Trends, Risks, and Opportunities. My name is Mike Delaney, and I'm an Extension Community and Economic Development Educator based up here in the Northern State Line region. Delighted to have you with us today. I'm going to begin with a few quick housekeeping notes. Please note that if you desire, you can activate Zoom's closed captioning function at the bottom of your screen. We will be recording today's webinar and making it available on our Community and Economic Development YouTube channel. So after the conclusion of today's presentation, registered participants will receive an email following up with a link to the recording of the webinar and related materials. So if you didn't register in advance and you were forwarded the links to this program and you'd like to receive the materials, please make sure to drop your email in the chat box to let us know. As always, you're welcome at any time to share your questions in the Zoom chat space. We will be addressing those in a Q&A period following the main presentation. Now I'd like to introduce Callie Jo McFarlane, who serves as a member of the board of Rural Partners, and her day job is as Director of Community Development for the village of Monticello, Illinois. Callie?
Thank you, Mike. Rural Partners is a federally designated rural development council for the state of Illinois. Norm Walzer has been a Rural Partners board member since it was established in 1989. So we're coming up on a milestone in a couple of years. As Professor Emeritus and Founding Director of the Illinois Institute of Rural Affairs housed at Western Illinois University, his research interests focus mainly on rural development issues. He's a wealth of information, and I am pleased to hand everything over to him.
Thank you very much, Callie Jo. Welcome everyone to the first webinar on business successions and transitions. We're especially thankful to the Institute for Rural Affairs, Rural Partners, and U of I Extension for hosting these events, and to Mike and Richard for working and making the arrangements so smoothly. Some of the material in this presentation is based on a recent book that Chris Merritt and I edited on this similar topic. Our concern was that the aging of business owners, especially in some rural small towns, will lead to a loss of essential services. While the national surveys have indicated that many residents would prefer to live in rural areas and small towns, their preferences are based on several factors. One is availability of housing, a safe living environment, access to education, healthcare, and recreational services, but also, and very important for their series, the ability to buy essential goods and services. And they want to live in places that have strong social capital, gathering places where they can be involved. And this is becoming, I think, more and more important in the surveys that we're seeing. So if you look at the smaller towns, the aging of longtime business owners will certainly bring some business closures, which may threaten the attractiveness, especially of small rural places. When the usual approaches of selling a business don't work, then the burden shifts to local leaders to find innovative ways to help retain the businesses. These strategies vary, of course, by local conditions and by place. But the current webinar series that we're launching is designed to help community leaders learn about and evaluate alternative business ownership options. The intent is not to provide a manual for any particular type of business ownership model, but rather the sessions can help listeners compare possible options and then pursue them in more detail in available sources. Our speaker today, Tessa Conroy, is Associate Professor in the Department of Agriculture and Applied Economics and is a Community Economic Development Specialist at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She conducts applied research and provides technical assistance related to economic growth and development, focusing mainly on small business dynamics. She's become kind of a go-to person on rural development issues, especially in the Midwest. And we thank Tessa for being willing to share her research and insights with us today. But again, just a reminder before we start, participants, please add your questions and comments in the chat box. And at the end of the presentation, we'll address as many questions as time permits. So Tessa, the mic is yours.
All right. Thanks so much, Norm, for the introduction. It's my pleasure to be here today. I'm going to set up my screen. Mike, can I get a thumbs up? Are
Looks
we at the
looks good.
Okay, great. So again, thank you for having me today. I am presenting on business succession, as Norm mentioned, and with the content today, I really wanted to level set around these trends that might have us concerned about business succession. So we'll be looking at shifts in aging, shifts in business ownership and entrepreneurial intent, self-employment rates, and I'm going to share with you some observations that I made in doing this research and working with Norm on the book that he mentioned. So with that, I have some background information to share on demographic change. And as we all know, the United States is aging. Uh, the big wave that we're thinking about with business succession is baby boomers retiring. So in 2011, the first baby boomers turned 65. In 2029, that will be when the last baby boomers turn 65. So we're really in the middle of a wave of large retirements. You can see that reflected in the median age. In 1870, the median age in the US was 28.1, most recently 39.1, and expected to go up a little bit more in the years to come. And we have a really large share of the population now over 65, 9.8% in 1970, approaching 20% in 2024, 2025. And when we think about why this is important for succession, it's because so many of these baby boomers, these group of the population that is nearing at or beyond retirement age, a lot of them own businesses. So according to the annual business survey, over 50% of business owners are over the age of 55. I want to highlight that the survey is just looking at businesses with paid employees. That represents a small share of businesses in the US. Only 20 to 25% of businesses in the US have paid employees. So when we think about sole proprietors or partnerships, a one man or one woman shop, those are actually excluded from that statistic. So we have this really large pool of people that's even unaccounted for here. So, what does this mean for business transition potentially? I have seen estimates ranging from 2 to 12 million businesses that could potentially change hands as the baby boomers retire. I want to highlight that these are estimates. Getting an exact number, in my experience, is actually pretty difficult. It would require having information on birth years of owners and then cross-referencing that with ownership records of businesses. And most of our survey materials, the census, just aren't designed to do that. So the best we can do is these estimates, and they're really wide ranging. I want to highlight some of the challenges here that typically when we're looking at data sets from the US Census that are about businesses, we get a lot of detail about the business itself, maybe revenue, maybe number of employees, but not about the owner. So it's hard to know how old is this owner? Does this owner own multiple businesses? Things like that. And then if we look to other data products from the census that are about individuals or households, I can learn a lot about the person, such as their age, but less about the person or about the business, excuse me. So I might know that they're self-employed, but I won't know how many businesses they own. Or I'll know that they're self-employed, but I won't know their ownership stake if they're a sole owner or have a minority share of ownership. So I just want to highlight going into this conversation that it's actually difficult to come up with an exact number of what we're working with when it comes to the potential impacts of retirement and business succession. Some other issues, even with the data that does exist, I mentioned the annual business survey, the age categorizations that they offer. So there are some statistics about the age of owners, but those ages are provided in bins, and that may or may not overlap with the age categories that we're interested in for retirement. They tend to be 10, 15, or 20-year bins. Our business owners 45 to 64, for example, or 55 to 64 or 65 plus. And so it's hard to be precise with the way those data are reported. The definition of the owner also varies. In general, the census considers ownership a majority share, so 51% or more. So if we're interested in people that own less than that, that's going to be hard to find with our census data sources. And then sampling sometimes is a relatively small sample. So we're not looking at necessarily collecting data from the universe of businesses in the United States. We're going to sample a small group and then make projections based on what we learn. And that can be sometimes narrow. For example, just businesses with paid employees, we're only going to learn about 20 to 25% of businesses in the United States. So I just want to go into this conversation noting these limitations so we have an idea about how detailed we can be in understanding the impacts of this transition. What are the risks? I want to start with here just a preview of why I think we care about this. I think there are other reasons, but here are some that are front of mind. One is about retirement security for owners. So as we have this population of business owners that is retiring, headed for retirement, or already retired, a lot of times their retirement security is connected to the sale of their business. And so we want to be thinking about income security and quality of life for this group of the population. At the community level, I think we're concerned about losing a large share of businesses. Norm highlighted this point. I have a rural lens primarily on this, but I think it's true in all different kinds of settings. But in rural communities, when we lose the pharmacy that's independently owned, or we lose the local veterinary practice, the grocery store, the hardware store because of retirement, and I can see this firsthand in my hometown, as those services go away, it just becomes harder to live in these rural places. You have to travel further to meet your needs on a routine basis. And so that's a concern. How is this affecting the livability of our rural communities? Employment. One estimate that I saw was that these retirement age business owners employ about 25 million people. Again, I think it's hard to know the exact count, but I think it's safe to say millions of jobs are connected to these businesses that are likely in a stage where they could be considering transition or succession. And so local employment impacts really matter. And then the institutional contributions to rural life. A lot of our businesses are providing gathering spaces. They're meeting basic needs of the population, health, goods, services, gathering places, child care, access to healthcare. These all really matter for the experience of living in a place that would be impacted by closure due to retirement. I want to highlight here, though, too, that there's the potential for transition to corporate ownership. We have evidence and examples of this in pharmacy and veterinary medicine. I think there are others, though. And what the literature that I've looked at suggests is that sometimes when there is a transition to corporate ownership from an independent ownership, a small locally owned business, we sometimes see a reduction in services. So maybe that veterinary clinic isn't going to offer emergency services anymore. Maybe that pharmacy isn't going to offer the same health screenings or 24-hour service. So sometimes it stays in the community, but it's going to change what's available. We do get worried about an economic leakage, that when we have ownership outside of that community, that we would see profits exit the locality and accumulate somewhere else far away. And so the income and profit associated with that is concerning. And then again, the sense of place. I think it's maybe hard to articulate, but when we arrive in a community and see a lot of locally owned businesses, it gives that community a unique character. If that's replaced with corporate ownership, I do hear communities share their concerns about how that would change the identity of their place. So I think these are some of the concerns and why we would want to engage on this topic, among others. So, to share with you today what I learned about business succession, I'm going to weave together a couple of data sources. Here in Wisconsin, we did the Midwest Entrepreneurial Climate Survey. That was a survey about entrepreneurial outcomes and attitudes and norms that we administered in Wisconsin and Minnesota that we hope to grow to other states, but it gives us a sense of some of the things we might be interested in. I'm going to use census data, the business formation statistics, county business patterns, and non-employer statistics. County business patterns and non-employers are basically complementary. One's going to look at businesses with paid employees, one's going to look at businesses without paid employees. And then the outcomes. I'm going to look at household and individual data that's harmonized census microdata. So the first thing I want to share with you, and if you remember sort of one thing from this first section, is just that there's a lot of entrepreneurial intent in the country and in the Midwest. So about 10 years ago, there were some headlines in the news, like the end of entrepreneurship in America, that was really concerned about the declining rate of startup activity in the US. I think that's actually sort of a distortion based on how we collect data. When we ask the question a different way, so we ask people, are you now or have you ever been engaged in the ownership or management of a business? We see that it's actually really prevalent, especially in rural communities. So I'm showing you again the results for Wisconsin and Minnesota, but we find that in rural communities, more than half of the population has some entrepreneurial experience or intention. And so there's a lot of people that are interested in making a living or generating income from business ownership. And even in urban areas, though it's less than in rural, we still see more than a third of people who are interested or have this skill, have this potential, this entrepreneurial potential. So I consider this a signal of entrepreneurial skill, of potential, of interest that could be leveraged into actual business ownership. Another way to think about entrepreneurial intent is to look at the business formation statistics. So this is a record of businesses applying for their employer identification number. It might be one of the earlier steps somebody who is interested in owning a business would take. They might need it, for example, to open a business bank account. So it tends to be sort of an earlier leading signal of entrepreneurial intent. It doesn't necessarily mean that that business will be fully formed. And what we see is that entrepreneurial intent reached new heights during the pandemic. And I think a lot of people, including myself, wondered if that was a blip. But what we have seen is sustained elevated interest in entrepreneurship. This intention is still there. The three lines I'm showing you with this graphic, the top red line is the total of applications. So we're seeing 300, 400,000 applications per month in the United States. The line below that in orange is a high propensity application. So these are applications that the census looks at, and they have certain characteristics that tell them these are actually pretty likely to go on and become fully formed businesses. And then in the yellow line, they're going to give an application or an applicant 2 years to realize their entrepreneurial intent and hire their first employees. And so those are business formations that come after 8 quarters, and then projections in the most recent period while we kind of give those most recent applicants some time to start their business. So what you see though is this big gap between entrepreneurial intent, the applications, the red line, and actual business formations, those businesses that hire employees. So I think there are a lot of people out there who are thinking about entrepreneurship, thinking about owning or managing a business, but just aren't making it to that over that hump of hiring their first employees. So when we look at actual business formations, we see that the number is a lot lower. So I'm going to let's toggle my screen a little bit. Well, we expect to see between 35 and 45,000 actual business formations in a month relative to all of those applications we saw. So it's actually a small fraction that are going to be realized. And when we look over time, what I've added to this chart here with the red line is the rate of fully formed businesses. So at the beginning of this data set, which started in 2004, we were seeing in the range of 15 to 20% of businesses actually go on to hire their employees. Now we see between 5 and 10%. So a much lower rate of business formation, businesses hiring their employees. So again, I think there are a lot of people out there that are interested in entrepreneurship that aren't entering into those businesses with paid employees. I think it's important to note, though, that this is only keeping track of those employer businesses. So of that 95% of applications that don't ever go on to hire employees, I suspect a large share of them are operating as non-employers. What we see nationally is that 22% of businesses in the United States have paid employees The remaining 78% are going to operate as those kind of one man, one woman shop, sole proprietor, maybe a partnership. They're not going to have payroll employees. And we don't keep track of those with the business formation statistics. But what we know from the Federal Reserve did some work on non-employers, and what they found is that about 25% of them would like to hire employees. And so if we think of growth, if we think of a pool of experienced entrepreneurs who we might tap to take on a larger enterprise through succession, there's a pool of people with experience that might be ready and interested to grow their businesses, but they're a little bit harder to find and a little bit harder to see. We don't keep as good of track of them. They might be home based, they might not have a storefront, they might be online. So finding these non-employers and sort of better understanding their intentions for growth or maybe their intentions to shift or acquire a business, I think will take some work. But they are really important. I just want to reiterate this point, especially in rural communities. So what I'm showing you here is a growth index of non-employer and employer businesses. So the solid lines are non-employer businesses. So the red line at the top is non-employer growth in urban areas. The black line is non-employer growth for the total United States. The blue solid line is non-employer growth in rural areas. And what you see is that non-employers are really the growth edge of business in the US right now, but especially in rural areas. I know that blue line is sort of sitting in the middle, but if you look at the dotted blue line at the bottom, that is the change in rural employer businesses. So what we're seeing is relative to the late 90s, early 2000s, there are actually fewer businesses with paid employees in the rural US than there were 20 years ago. What is growing are the non-employer businesses. So I think it's really important to sort of pay attention to this pool of people and think about what role they might play in preserving the businesses we do have that are so important to rural life. So takeaways from this kind of first section here, that there is a lot of entrepreneurial intent in the US. A large share of it is going to be hard to see, those non-employer businesses. And I think that that pool of people could be a promising audience for targeted programming around business succession. With this next portion, I want to shift to thinking about self-employed. So thinking about rather than businesses, what can we learn from looking at individuals and households? And what I have here for you is the growth index of the number of self-employed people age 67 plus. And you'll see that it's almost doubled since the early 2000s. This for me is a little bit interesting, maybe even concerning. If we think about those starting slides that I showed you, and we're thinking about the baby boomers growing older, maybe approaching ready, nearing retirement, and the potential for millions of businesses to change hands to younger business owners, this makes me think it's not happening. That while we're sort of expecting what some have called like the silver tsunami, it is not impacting business ownership, at least based on this signal or this the signal we're getting from this data. That if business owners of retirement age were transitioning, were handing their businesses off to a younger cohort, selling them, finding a new owner, that this number would not be growing like it has been. And so I think there's a lot of important questions for us to answer in terms of what are the reasons why we're not seeing succession. This is even more pressing in rural communities. So I'm showing the percent of self-employed who are ready for retirement in rural versus urban settings. And we know that rural America is generally a little older than urban, and that's showing up here in self-employment. So I suspect the sort of concerns that we have around losing businesses or the changing character of our communities if those businesses go to corporate ownership is more pressing in rural communities. I want to highlight here that the next generation of business owners is likely to be very different, and we can see hints of that here with this household and individual data. So on the left-hand side, I'm showing you the percent of self-employed who are male by age group. So what you see is the purple line at top. Those are our self-employed individuals who are 67 or older, and the large majority of them is male. As we get younger and younger, going down to our youngest cohort in blue, those are self-employed folks aged 25 to 35. They have the very smallest share of males as self-employed people. So the gender composition is changing. If we look at the figure on the right, we're doing the same thing, but thinking about racial and ethnic identities. And what we see here is that the very oldest cohort in blue, so 67 plus, have the smallest share of minority identities in that population. And then as we get older, our youngest cohorts under 45, 25 to 45 have the highest share of minority ownership. And this is speaking to demographic change and the sort of racial and ethnic composition of the country. But I think in terms of business succession, this is just the tip of the iceberg. I think that we can expect to see pretty large differences on average between worldviews, maybe expectations, goals of the business, household dynamics. I'll comment a little bit more on this at the end, but I think understanding these differences and how to create matches between current owners and future business owners is also relevant to the conversation. So from those few slides, I hope you remember that there is a lot of opportunity to become a business owner through succession. If that share of self-employed who are 67 plus are really ready to think about selling or transitioning out of their business, there's a lot of opportunity, but we're just not seeing it on a large scale based on these data. So with these last few slides, I want to offer some insights about why that might be. So this data comes from that entrepreneurial climate survey that I mentioned. And we asked people, in your opinion, which best describes the business climate in your country, state, and community. And what we see across our two states, generally a little better in Minnesota than in Wisconsin, but fewer than 4 in 10 respondents said that their local business climate was good or excellent. And so maybe there's some pessimism out there about the business climate and the prospects of operating as a business owner that we could think about addressing or targeting with programming that's giving people hesitation or acting as a barrier to realizing that entrepreneurial intent that we saw at the beginning of the presentation. This is also from that survey, and we asked our respondents, again, this is a household survey, so we were asking people whether they were entrepreneurs or not, just sort of their perception of the business climate. And we were asking them, how much support do you think you would get from various groups versus how much support you should get from various groups? So we started with your family, looking at community members, local businesses, local elected officials, and state government. And what we see is that when it comes to family, family is actually exceeding expectations in terms of what people are thinking they would get versus what they should, that they're getting even more support from their family. When it comes to community members, though, and then as we sort of march down the rows, local businesses, elected officials, state government, we see these increasingly large gaps between what people hope or expect or perceive they would get from these groups versus what they would actually get. And so I think there's an opportunity here to address the gap. And I'm not sure if this is a gap about knowledge of services. I think there are a lot of programs and a lot of entities serving entrepreneurs, but I think it's tricky to get business owners and entrepreneurs the support they need when they need it and for them to know about it at the right moment. So maybe this is a visibility, maybe it's targeting. I think there are a lot of questions to ask around this result, but it does seem to be the case that entrepreneurs are sort of hoping or feel that they should get a lot more support than they would actually get. So some other themes that came up in preparing this chapter and doing this research on business succession is one about opaque and invisible markets. So what I mean by that is that when a person wants to buy groceries, they know where to go to do that. They know where the market is. If you want to buy a house, you sort of know, we can go look at realtor.com or call our local real estate agent. We want to buy an airplane ticket, we sort of know where that market is, where to go to make that purchase. We also have quite a bit of information about that purchase, right? If you want to buy an ingredient or some food item, there's quite a bit of nutritional information, where it's from. We can kind of have some amount of transparency with what we're purchasing. Same with like airline tickets, right? If we're looking at a house, we can get all the specs and the tax history and that sort of thing. And I'm not sure that we, have a parallel when it comes to purchasing a business or thinking about succession. Where would we go if somebody was interested and didn't have existing network connections? Where would they go to learn about what businesses might be available, and how would they gather information on them? Um, so I suspect that this is a challenge in some communities and some settings. Personal readiness comes up again and again and again, that our business owners, for a wide range of reasons, do not consider themselves ready for transition or succession. Part of that has to do with personal identity, that for some business owners, they're just so connected to their craft. They identify so strongly with their business. It's really uncomfortable to think about separating from it. It can also make change really uncomfortable. I have kind of close proximity to an independently owned veterinary practice, considering these changes. And I think it's really hard for the current owner to think about the clinic in under future ownership, changing hours or changing services. But the current cohort, the youngest cohort of veterinarians, they're more likely to be in a dual income household, more likely to be sharing child rearing and household responsibilities. And so their time availability is more constrained. And this sort of generational change is one of the barriers that I see in this specific example, but seems to translate to other settings as well. Um, Another concept that came up is a performance threshold. This idea that a business owner doesn't feel ready to sell until they've met a specific performance threshold. So I need sales to reach to a certain level, or I need to have a certain level of success that I can make these capital improvements or remodel or fix up the building or buy the new equipment. But the goalpost keeps moving. And so business owners are just never ready because they're trying to get to that threshold, and that threshold might be moving. And for that reason, we don't see succession planning. Estimates on how many business owners have a succession plan vary, but my impression from these different estimates is that most do not. And part of it just comes from readiness. I'm just not ready to plan yet. So if I were talking to a business owner, based on what I learned from this work, would be don't wait until you're ready, do it before you're ready, as sort of a nudge in that direction. A couple other comments here. One is about business readiness, digitizing records, automating processes, making things overall attractive to a future buyer or the next owner of your business. About a year ago, I stayed at a cute little hotel, and it was immaculate, and it was a great experience. But I noticed that the owner had everything. The reservations were all handwritten. There was no online platform, and I bet she knew where every little piece of information was, and had a great sort of wealth of knowledge about her business. But without that being organized in a way that's easily transferable, I can see that being a challenge potentially for an interested buyer. Reducing information asymmetries. This is something that I also think is really important. So there is a lot of economic research about how markets don't work well when we have information asymmetry. So in particular, we see this show up when buyers have more information about what they're selling than, or excuse me, when sellers have more information about what they're selling than the buyers do. And then a good example of this is a used car market. So sellers have lots of information about the condition of that vehicle, but the buyers do not. And so buyers then understand the risk and are just not willing to pay for cars on the used car market because they're incorporating that risk. So the market sort of unravels, and we see cars going, even in good condition, below market value. So the translation here is, how might a buyer or a successor know if the business is in good condition? Are there ways that we can sort of prudently have some information sharing and transparency about the state of the business so that a buyer knows what they're getting? And the flip side of this is that I think sellers really want to know oftentimes, especially when we see sellers who are interested in a stewardship strategy, meaning that the business and the employees are sort of entrusted to the next person and they are feeling confident about how their clients are going and customers are going to be cared for with this next owner. They really want the right buyer, this person that is going to carry on the mission of their business. And so how can a seller get that information, get those signals from an interested party? And so I think about an extension and these other business support services. What can we do to facilitate those information exchanges and help buyers and sellers learn about each other to make it a less risky transaction? The last thing that I'll share with you is about how relationship shape transitions. Social capital really plays a role, we're finding, in how transitions take place. So what we've seen is that when business owners interact and converse and confide with a relatively small but high trust group, that's more likely to result in a stewardship strategy where this business owner finds a successor that's going to continue the mission, the employment, the services to clients in the way that they are hopeful and committed to. When business owners have a larger and more diverse networks with lots of kind of weak ties and connections, but exposure to a lot of different ideas, that tends to correlate with a cessation or financial harvest strategy, where a business owner is sort of maximizing their return on a sale of a business. So relationships matter. I don't think that's, probably surprising to anybody here, but it can really flavor the preferences and direction of a business sale. I'll conclude by offering a couple potential opportunities. I think that, again, there's a lot of entrepreneurial intent out there to be leveraged. And I think a lot of people imagine entrepreneurship as owning a new business, but perhaps that could be repurposed or translated into succession and transition. I think there's a role for extension business support to encourage readiness. One of the things that came up in the literature in doing research on this topic was that business owners that have a clear idea about what they're going to do after they retire, after they step away from their business, viewed themselves as more ready for that step. So I thought that was really useful. How can we get business owners thinking about what will come next and how might that support readiness? Things we can do to facilitate exchanges between current and potential owners with different values and experiences, internships and apprenticeships, encouraging these types of programs can be a powerful way for business owners, prospective sellers to learn about each other and feel more comfortable with the transition and maybe sort out some of those differences. I think I mentioned earlier, one of the examples that we came across was attitudes about sustainability and environmental practices. And so the younger cohort more often signals sustainability as a key value. And so how can we think about a transition towards more sustainable practices? Perhaps that might make a business more attractive, or having conversations around these types of changes so that both parties feel more comfortable. And then the technical assistance component, helping with that digitizing, helping with that automation process so that records are more readily transferable, thinking about assessments and getting all of the necessary pieces in place, seem like they're all opportunities for those of us in the business support space to consider. So with that, we'll have plenty of time for questions, but I want to thank you for having me today. And I hope we were able to sort of get a big picture of the trends and think a little bit about an introductory conversation to understanding those risks and opportunities as we face a potential large wave of transition and succession in the US.
Thank you very much, Tessa, for the excellent presentation. As I look at the chat box, I don't think we have any questions. So, excuse me. So let me just start with a couple here that, as I was listening, just kind of coming to mind. One is, as you look at some of the work that you and Steve Diller actually have done in terms of the fourth wave economic development, where it really places the important thing rather than so much incentives or small business, these kinds of things we've talked about in the past. But as I'm looking at place now as an important incentive, And then I'm matching this up with what's happening technology-wise. So we've got a situation where you have Amazon, for example, that delivers the next day. So if you're living in a small rural area and you want to buy something, it's faster and probably cheaper and easier, certainly, to get it delivered the next day. So do we really need as much reliance on hardware stores, for example, or as on, that's probably not true of grocery stores. But the other thing would be, I think on the horizon are driverless cars. So we're talking now about living in a small town and you need to go to a medical situation somewhere or medical treatment. We'll probably be able to order a car and have it drive you there and drive you back. So it seems like those kinds of things, plus we're offering healthcare in a more remote area through the technology. So any thoughts in terms of, are we reshaping what the demands are for high quality of life in a small community as we have all these technology changes? So are we really looking at something totally different? Just any thoughts?
Yeah, so many important sort of trends and potentially competing trends to think about. So starting, I think, with the most basic observation, right, is that for rural communities, I think that a lot of them feel more accessible to parts of the population that don't live in rural areas because they can work remotely, right? So just the sort of expansion of broadband, right? So I think that it's reasonable to think that for people that want to live in rural communities, that will be a more tractable option. And I think that that's good for rural communities and rural business owners who are going to acquire customers through that process. So just sort of basic broadband infrastructure, I expect to be good for rural areas, rural business owners, and future rural residents. That said, the changes in AI and the way we distribute goods and services is hard to predict. It does seem that things like driverless cars, the other ways that we might automate. I was just looking at an article kind of concerned about the future positions as cashiers. Maybe I think the upside is that this could be good for rural business owners. It could make it a little bit more affordable. I do worry about, of course, as everyone does, the employment trajectory. I think it's too soon to tell as we lose some jobs in different industries. But I still think that people are interested in having communities that are vibrant. They're interested in gathering places. They still need childcare, which is very, high touch. And so I really still think that there's a place for a lot of Main Street type businesses, among others, in rural communities that will still have a need for all of those things. I think about healthcare and education, and maybe this is just my personal perspective, but these are all things that are perhaps inherently relational, and people will keep showing up to interact with a person on a lot of these different transactions.
Thanks. One of the questions from Richard was why is there growth in non-employer businesses in rural areas? And what are the reasons behind that trend? And are there specific sectors to be watching for?
Yeah. I think several things are contributing to that growth of non-employers. I think one is that the sort of efficient scale of business has changed, where we used to maybe have a large company, maybe like a newspaper, for example. They maybe had a photographer and a journalist and an editor all in-house, and maybe the photographer now is outsourced, or maybe we had a large manufacturer and they had in-house legal and they had an in-house accountant, and now they're contracting out for those services. So one large business has sort of been replaced by a smaller company that is connected to a sort of system of satellite contractors. And so that amounts to just smaller businesses overall and more contractors. Certainly, technology and advancements in technology have played a role in the sort of smaller, efficient scale and the ability to function as a top contractor. So Uber and Lyft definitely play into this trend as well. And I think in rural areas, there is an element of resourcefulness that rural areas have had tepid employment growth, a lot of them for the last decade and a half. And so if it becomes more difficult to find employment in working for another organization, that there's a certain element or a component of this that is people creating a job for themselves. And we should be thinking about that component too.
Reasonable. Uh, Another question, what are some ways that you recommend to facilitate transitions between ethnic and gender differences between owners and buyers?
Yeah, I really, I'm not an expert in this, but it does seem that like conversation, bringing people together is just so powerful for having, for understanding each other, understanding those differences, talking directly to one another. And we see this show up in entrepreneurial literature all the time, that just relationship building, trust building, networking, bringing people together, peer-to-peer learning. These are all really powerful in terms of supporting business outcomes and business performance as well. And so I see the potential for a parallel here, that bringing people together, I think Extension is a good partner for this, that like oftentimes in Extension we're network weavers and connectors. And I think that that could work well here.
I think that's really true. And based on my experience in rural Illinois, there's a really significant growth in minority populations in the state,
Mhm.
in downstate particularly, well, all over the state. And so it seems like what you said really is even broader than, so we have to build these new networks for just community development in general, in addition to the business development sector of it. Um,
Mhm.
Another question was, what is your experience with the successful matching program between sellers and buyers? And how do we help a younger buyer understand what he or she is getting into? And I think this really extends to, maybe if you have any comments on what can schools do to participate in this entrepreneurial effort.
Yeah, I don't probably have a great answer, unfortunately. Most of my work has been more on the sort of traditional startup side. And so I don't have a lot of programming on succession myself. I'm hoping our future webinars coming out of this program will be able to answer that question. But it does seem to be that these internship and apprenticeship programs work pretty well. We have an example of a pretty successful veterinary internship program that I have in mind, that helps, build a relationship, that it helps, these two parties get to know each other and understand their differences and their goals for the business. So that is one route, but I'm sure there are many others.
Another question came in was, what might be an example of a threshold performance level when a business owner is ready to sell? And I think this is a really important question, as you alluded earlier. Business
Mhm.
owners don't necessarily want to alert their customers that they're not going to continue. So,
Mhm.
can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so this idea originally shows up in research actually, with regard to like closure or failure, that like if my business starts performing below a certain level, that will be the point at which I decide to shut down or close or get out of this gig. But then more recently, this concept has been translated to like there's a performance threshold associated with succession and transition. Um, and so these different performance thresholds might feed into a preference for different strategies that I see it most often in terms of sort of sales, right? Or some sort of cosmetic thing. So the one example that I have is a business owner who told me like, I'm not going to be ready to sell until I get the whole front office remodeled, right? So he really wanted to have this sort of crown jewel ready to go and beautiful for the next person. So I think it's highly subjective. I think that it depends a little bit on what their goals are. The example I have in mind, this business owner really wanted to have their business stay in the community and be locally owned. And so I think they were very concerned about making it attractive for the next person. And that was their primary goal. I can imagine, though, if you're interested in what they call like a financial harvest, where you just kind of maybe sell and maximize the profit coming from the business, that the performance goals maybe have more to do with a sales trajectory or a certain sort of financial outcome. So I think it varies from person to person.
I think that's right on. Some of the work that I did when I was working or traveling in Vermont was I ran into situations where, since the people were about to retire and their business was their nest egg, they actually disinvested over the last couple of years, and they didn't remodel and they didn't do things which really raised the cost of the business to the an incoming buyer. And
Mhm.
as a result, some of the public groups, the uh, nonprofits really got involved in this, and they had access to funds where they could actually kind of lower the cost to an incoming business person, through other grants and things. So, but I think that's a good point. A question now is what's your view on utilizing a business valuation professional, not only to determine the value of the business asset, but also to promote the sale with potential buyers?
Yeah, this isn't something that I have a lot of expertise in, so I want to be transparent about that. But it does show up a lot in the literature that like seeking professional guidance, getting sort of the house in order in advance of preparing to sell or as part of succession planning is often a good idea. So this information gathering, having all of the necessary records together so that you can have that information exchange with a potential buyer is really important. So my inclination is to think that it's probably a good idea. And anecdotally, I don't have, a statistic on this. It seems like oftentimes rural businesses will sort of need a broker, or they will need somebody with the connections across industry to aid in finding a buyer.
You addressed this a little bit earlier, but there's another question I think is kind of intriguing too, is in terms of the ways that youth entrepreneurship programs and in Illinois and some other places, we've got creating entrepreneurial opportunities, the CEO program that's been pretty successful around the state.
Mhm.
But any comments in terms of how that might be used more for a transition rather than in an entrepreneurial startup?
Yeah, I'm optimistic. I mean, I think anytime that we are working with students and thinking about professional opportunities or their career trajectory, and entrepreneurship, business ownership is on that menu of alternatives, I think that helps find good matches, right? That people, it helps people find their way. And I think entrepreneurship, business ownership is a really viable path, but it requires a particular skill set, and we want students to be aware of that as early as possible so they can get the necessary skills, right? And even within entrepreneurship, as with any other sort of field or broad category of a way to earn a living, there's lots of variation, right? So there's going to be franchise, there's going to be the independent owners. And so making students aware there's going to be, taking over the family farm. There are lots of ways in which to become a business owner. And the more that we can incorporate that into student education, I am inclined to think that that's, a good thing that can be part of maintaining and sustaining businesses, particularly in rural areas.
Actually, just a reminder to the listeners that we'd like to do a quick poll for you to kind of help in planning future programs, and so Mike will put this up on the screen, but then we'll have one more question, and the question really is: in your research, have you found just particular communities that have done really well in terms of these match ups or whatever they're trying to accomplish? Just some examples.
I'm sorry, Norm, I cut out for just a second.
Oh,
Was
okay.
there a
I
question for
see.
me?
Were there some examples of communities that you've run across in your research that just have done particularly a good job in being able to transition to businesses or to retain them or along these lines, particularly I
Yeah,
guess with youth?
Um, some that I've kind of already mentioned are top of mind, and I will try to think of something else. But it does seem that these sort of apprenticeship internship programs are really effective. I know I mentioned that, but also any sort of like local entrepreneurial network, when the doors are open to potential or interested business owners, right? We see a lot of sometimes kind of entrepreneurial working groups at a local level, business owners supporting one another, having conversations, often meeting informally over coffee, that can be an opportunity to invite in potential business owners. And so I would just encourage communities to, if you already have some of that social infrastructure in place, to think about leveraging it to bring in the next generation of business owners to facilitate connections, have conversations, and reduce some of those maybe gaps or disconnects between our current and future business owners.
A comment here from Mike Darker, who's done a lot of work on entrepreneurial research. In our Minnesota owner research, we found that increased business readiness for transition is correlated with asking accountants, attorneys, and spouses for advice. Any comments on this or other ways of building this readiness?
I mean, I already mentioned it, but I'll say it again because anecdotally it seems powerful, but it also shows up in the work, the literature that I was reading. Quite a bit of this idea of like this person who is the business owner who is thinking about succession is much more likely to act on it if they know what they're going to do next. So are they going to operate as a sort of advisor, a consultant on this business, or are they going to move to the Sun Belt and enjoy, their hobbies? Like having a clear vision for what they want for themselves does seem to be really powerful. And again, I don't have a national statistic on this, but it does seem like, at least through personal experience, that the ones that do have that vision, that are ready to think about what comes next, are also more ready to prepare for that transition.
Great. I guess I'll turn it over to Mike in a second or two, but just to talk a little bit about the rest of the series. What we're interested in doing here now, again, as we mentioned at the beginning, is we'd like to just provide some options. Tessa's done an excellent job of giving us the setting. Here's what's going on. These are the people you're going to be working with, these kinds of things. What we'd like to do in the next sessions, as we're going through, is talk a little bit about do succession plans work very often? And yeah, they're a great thing to do and they're essential, or we encourage them. But frankly, they haven't been as successful as what we'd like them to be. So then, why is that? And then we'd like to talk a little bit about different types of ownership models, like a employee ownership model, and we'll have a person talk about those kinds of things. And we'll talk about cooperatives as another alternative. And we'll talk about if those things don't work, we'll talk a little bit about, can your community get together, buy the building, do something to have a community supported enterprise. So that's really what's coming in the next 4 to 5 sessions. And so we really appreciate Tessa being here and getting us off to a great start. And so, Mike, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Norm. I do want to, on behalf not only of the University of Illinois Extension, but also Rural Partners and the Illinois Institute for Rural Affairs, say a thank you to Tessa Conroy for being here today. Tessa, thank you for the presentation, for your time, for your efforts.
My pleasure.
Also like to thank you, Norm, for your moderation, not only of this session, but also for the series. As I mentioned earlier to the folks still in the room, if you're registered for the webinar, you will receive presentation materials as well as a link to the recording and a follow-up email. If you're not already receiving our email notices about upcoming webinar offerings, I will ask you to please drop your email into the chat before you go, and we'll add you to the email list. The next program in the Rural Business Transition series will be on Tuesday, March 24th. Again, during the noon hour, it'll be on the evolution of succession planning, strengths, shortfalls, and innovative pathways forward. Also want to invite you to visit our website at go.illinois.edu/LGE in order to access the video archives of prior presentations on a wide variety of community development topics. Thank you, everyone, for attending today's webinar. Appreciate you being here. Have a great day, and we hope to see you back for future presentations. Thanks so much.
Yeah.